Hi, everybody. Welcome to the State of the School Address. This is a tradition we began 5 years ago in September of 2021. And so I'm very excited. This is my fourth State of the School Address for the year that I was away. Dean Megan Ranney did the State of the School. And, reflecting on this year and thinking about the 100 or so of you here, we have more than 100 people online, thinking about the question of what is the state of the school. And as I thought about this and discussed it with colleagues and friends, to me, the answer to this question has actually never been easier to answer. The answer, in my mind, is very straightforward. The state of the school is as strong as it has ever been. And over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to make the case to you that we are fulfilling our mission and doing exactly what we need to be doing at this moment. So let's talk about this moment. It's obviously not an easy moment in public health. I don't need to tell any of you that. I would argue the last year has been extraordinarily difficult in lots and lots of ways. It's been extraordinarily difficult for public health writ large. It's been very challenging for universities specifically, and it's been very challenging for our school. And we can all think back through the last 6-9 months and what an incredible challenge it has been for our school, and translated what an incredible challenge it has been for each of you, whether you're a faculty, a student, a staff member. It has been truly, in my mind, extraordinary. This spring, many of our faculty got notices that their grants were being terminated because they were antithetical to scientific inquiry. Now, we're all used to getting critiques of our work, but this was not a well-reasoned critique. This was, in my mind, unfounded overreach by our government to shape and censor the kind of research that went on in universities. Our students who were looking forward to graduating saw public health agencies where they were going to go and apply their trade to make people's lives better get gutted financially and jobs eliminated. We saw many of our alumni who lead these public health agencies witness life-saving programs get eliminated. And then I think about our staff, our administrative staff and our research staff who've had to pivot, who've had to shift. With every new crisis, with every new day, it feels like there's a new challenge. It's been a very hard year. And I think we have to begin by acknowledging the difficulty of the time that we are in. But as we do that, I want to take a moment to think about how we have responded and how we have rallied. Because when I make the case that the state of the school is as strong as ever, and I will come back to that with both stories and data, to me, what has allowed the school to be as strong and as resilient has been the response of all of you in the face of these unprecedented challenges. And that's where I want to begin today. Now, before I get more into the details of what we have been doing as a school, I want to take a moment to acknowledge a few things that have happened over the last couple of months. As many of you know, actually I assume all of you know, in July, the university reached an agreement with the federal government. Until that date, we had had months and months of our NIH funding frozen. There's good news here. And the good news is all of the back payments that the federal government owed us for contracts have now been repaid. A lot, not all, but a lot of the terminated grants have been restored. And so the life-saving work that we do, the research that we do, is back. We're able to get back into doing the work that we've been doing for years, and that's the good news. But I also want to say that as the crisis has eased, there are substantial headwinds that we still face. The university faces a structural deficit. I remind people we are part of the university. And that means that we have substantial financial headwinds. And the weeks and months and maybe not years, but certainly the weeks and months ahead, we're going to continue to make difficult choices to make sure that the mission of the school is intact and that we're executing on the things that really matter to us. So when I say and talk about the state of the school is very strong as it's ever been, what is the basis for saying that? And to me, the most important metric that we can use to judge ourselves and to understand our mission and whether we're accomplishing our mission is to look at the impact of the school. And I want to spend some time with all of you going through that. So let's get specific. When you're a great public health school, it begins with great education. Inspiring the next generation of leaders to go out and do great public health work. In numbers, what that means is we have more than 630 graduate students that are currently enrolled at the Brown School of Public Health. That is the biggest number that we've ever had. About 140 undergraduate concentrators, the biggest numbers we've ever had. The bottom line is that our educational mission is growing and is continuing to have very substantial impact. And I can tell you about all the great things that are happening in the classroom, but I want to actually now shift to a conversation with somebody who can give you a much more on-the-ground experience of what it's like teaching and what it's like innovating in the classroom. And for that, I want to bring up my friend and colleague, Brandon Marshall. Brandon, come on up. So you all know Brandon. Let's give him a round of applause. Now, most people know Brandon as a great scholar, as the director of the People, Places, and Health Collective, somebody who's done really groundbreaking work on opioids and opioid use disorder and how we reduce harm from these disorders. But that's actually not why I've asked Brandon to come up. I asked him to put on another hat, which is as a great educator. And so, Brandon, why don't we have a seat? And I have a few questions for you. And we're going to talk a little bit about what is happening in the classroom from your perspective. So, Brandon, you teach a class, PHP 2150, and it, like other classes you have taught, has a wide range of students. PHP 2150 has master's and doctoral students. I know you and I have talked about classes where you've had everyone from sophomores and junior undergrads all the way to PhD students. So the first question I have for you is, how do you manage that diversity of experience and knowledge? How do you teach effectively when you have 20-year-olds who are taking a public health class for the first time and older, I won't get into ages, older students who are far along in their PhDs? How do you manage that breadth of diversity?
Yeah, mature students. We'll
mature students. We're all mature students.
Yeah, I think you want to draw from and leverage that diversity of background and perspective in the classroom, and try to get students talking to each other and learning from each other from their different backgrounds and experiences and where they are in their own training. Several years ago, I used to teach the infectious disease epidemiology class, where I did have undergraduate students, even from junior, senior classes, and it was so rich. And they're coming from applied math, they're coming from economics, they're just taking this class as an elective, maybe under the open curriculum. So they're bringing all of those diverse backgrounds to the classroom and working with and talking to people who are doing a PhD in epidemiology. And I just think that's so rich and is really a unique and exciting aspect of teaching at Brown, that we're able to foster that and really, I think, as faculty benefit from that diversity. So I don't see it as a challenge really at all. I've never come across that. More so a richness to the classroom that you can draw on.
But I would think there would still be some difficulty of this breadth of experience. So how do you think about this in terms of you as a teacher, you as part of a team? What do you draw on to make sure that you're bringing everybody along, that it's still super interesting and innovative for the doctoral student, but not so difficult for the very smart but less experienced undergrad?
Yeah, great question. I think there's an outdated idea that the educational experience is the transmission of knowledge from the instructor to the student. And really, I think of it as a team sport, right? And so we have incredible resources here at Brown, the Sheridan Center, our Office of Education and Student Services and the support specialists, the TAs that are working with students. And I really see them as so critical to providing those wraparound services, especially for students that might not have the same background or orientation that especially, say, our PhD and graduate students do. So I'm trying to layer in those resources and really highlight them and give it that perception that it's not just about me, it really is drawing on all of the resources that you have available to you at Brown to make sure that you can be successful in this class. Yeah.
I love that, and I do think Brown is unique in its incredibly rich resources for education and for teaching. One question, when I think about all the accolades your class has gotten, one of the things that students often bring up is that PHP 2150, for instance, is a methods course, yet have this incredible mix of sort of theoretical and practical information. Talk a little bit more about that. How do you work that into a methods course? Why do you work that into a methods course? And how do you keep work relevant?
Yeah, and this has come from evaluation. So I've learned from the students that tell me and say, we want more examples from your own work because that's where you are excited. We can tell that gives that richness and excitement to the methods that we're learning. So I've actually leaned into that and draw a lot more now on examples from my own work or experience that highlight the importance or the value of learning a specific method. One example of that, several years ago I sat on an FDA advisory committee that was tasked with evaluating the effect of the reformulation of OxyContin. Purdue had made the medication abuse deterrent, basically to try to prevent non-oral consumption. And they presented data in this meeting showing that in a privately insured cohort, it seemed like overdose mortality decreased in people that started using the reformulated version, which is kind of counterintuitive or not what I would have expected. But there was a lot of loss to follow-up in that study. People lost insurance, were not included, right? They were censored. And there are reasons why someone would lose private insurance that are related to overdose mortality, for example, unemployment, right? And so that's an example where something that seems esoteric like selection bias really matters. To understand that method helps you evaluate what you're seeing, critically evaluate that information. And I'd like to highlight too the impact. Some of this evidence was really central in the lawsuits that were launched by states and counties against these manufacturers. The stakes matters. So we like to think maybe these methods are for dorks or nerds, but really they make a huge impact on public health. And so highlighting that, I think, has helped the students understand why are we teaching these methods? Why are they important?
Awesome. Last quick question for you. The other thing I've seen from your reviews from the students is they always talk about how you are able to keep the material super fresh and relevant. Yeah. Is that largely leaning into your own experience? How else do you do it? Why do you do that?
Yeah, that is. I try to continue to draw on recent studies from my own work or from the field that I'm most equipped with. And I think that behooves all of us as instructors not to let the material go stale. And there's a broader point, too, to try to keep introducing new scholars in the field that are contributing different perspectives, make sure the curriculum and the readings represent diverse perspectives from both senior and early career scholars. I think that just adds so much richness to the learning. So, yeah, I guess that's how I do it, is every year just evaluate, are there things out there that are new and exciting that I could draw on and incorporate into the class?
Awesome. Brandon, thank you so much for coming up.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So Brandon is really unusual, both in his incredible scholarship, but also his ability to translate that into the classroom. And one of the things I've often thought about is one of the great things about Brown is the emphasis on scholars, research scholars, people who are researchers, teaching in the classroom. That there is an excitement that comes from students listening and hearing directly from people who are doing groundbreaking research. And I think that is one of the distinctive things about the Brown Public Health education. Now, one of the journeys we began on a few years ago was thinking about how to expand the public health education experience at Brown. When I arrived here about 5 years ago, we were a small public health school. Over the next couple of years, we more than doubled our residential master's program. And while that was great, and it is great, we felt that there were a lot of people out there who could benefit from a Brown public health education who could not come to Providence, for whom that was not practical, it was not realistic, they were not going to be able to be a student here on campus. And so a few years ago, we started the online MPH program. And to talk a little bit about the online MPH program and why he decided to be a part of it, and somebody who graduated in our first cohort is Sean McLean, and I'd love to have Sean come up and chat with us. Hey, Sean, thanks so much. So have a seat. Okay, so Sean, I would love for you to just start off by talking to us a little bit about who you are, what you do, why you decided to get an online MPH.
Of course.
And then I'll ask you why Brown. But let's start with kind of what you do. And I see you've got a pin that might give us some idea of who you are.
Yes, a little sneak peek. But first, I'd just love to say thank you again, Dr. Jha, and to the whole Brown community for this wonderful opportunity to come speak. I've felt very at home in my entire time in the Brown community, from my first days in the online MPH until now. Some of the most incredible people I've met so far. So thank you so much for this phenomenal opportunity. And yes, so my name is Sean McLean. I am a recent alumni of the online MPH program, but I am also a community disaster program specialist for the American Red Cross, and I work primarily out of New York City in disaster preparedness and disaster response.
And say more about some of the experiences you've had with disaster response during the time you've been in the online MPH program as a student, and how your day job and your educational journey have interacted.
It's very fascinating, honestly. Over the time I was in the online MPH program, I was working full-time in my disaster role, which in many cases actually involved deployment to disaster areas. And this is one area where the online MPH structure really helped a lot in my career and ensuring I could complete both my educational and career goals. I was deployed in Asheville following Hurricane Helene. I was deployed to the Lahaina wildfires for Maui, and both of those were during my time in the online MPH. And I found that while I was conducting the online MPH, not only were the faculty extremely accommodating and understanding that my schedule was very atypical and that there may be some absences involved when I'm deployed for 3 weeks or more in these disaster settings, but I was also amazed by the amount of overlap between what I was learning and in the classroom and what I was experiencing in the field. And I've often heard, that the online MPH was to learn public health while doing public health. And I really feel like I experienced that fully, both from a public health perspective and seeing the social determinants of health in action, and also from some of the skills I was able to actually learn. For instance, if I can give one quick example, I remember I was taking the course on leadership with Dr. Karen Andes, who I saw briefly actually before this event. And I remember learning a lot about transformational leadership in a public health setting. Now, when I was in Asheville, North Carolina, following Hurricane Helene, there were many times that we had to make very difficult decisions, and I was in a leadership position that, at that point, was my first time in that high of a role. And I was thinking directly about topics we learned in that course while I was building my team of fellow staff members and volunteers. And when we wrapped up that deployment, I had a list of people who said, I would follow you to any deployment you went to, call on me and I'll be there. And then I had a short list that we stayed in touch with. We stayed in touch this whole time of people who I feel like I can call on and trust to help in a disaster setting. And it was all because of the lessons I learned in Dr. Andy's course. So I felt I was applying the things I was learning in these courses in real time to conduct my work in the field. So.
That's awesome. That's always sort of what we hope will happen. Those are great examples. One last question for you. There are a lot of online MPH programs. Mm-hmm. Why did you decide to come to Brown?
So it's very interesting. Brown has always been a dream school of mine, so to speak. I've always had an immense admiration for Brown and the work of the faculty here and the community. But when I was looking at my career path, I recognized the choice between focusing on full-time work or focusing on education. And a lot of the times when I went to talk to other programs, I won't name any names, of course, but there was a very much an
Lesser programs.
even in online MPH programs, I was very surprised that many seem to not want to accommodate working while also completing schoolwork. And this was something that I found very interesting because, my career and my time with the Red Cross was very important to me. And that was one thing that stuck out to me immediately from my very first conversations with faculty at Brown when I was in the application phase, was there was this atmosphere of, we want to accommodate you. We want to make sure that we can accommodate your career, we can accommodate your needs, and make sure that you are a welcome part of this community, even if you do need to deploy or work needs to take a priority. And throughout my entire time at Brown, that was consistently reinforced. I mean, we were made to feel as though we were full parts of the campus community, even in the online setting. I was able to come to campus, meet professors. We formed a very tight-knit community, even with people in different time zones. But at no point did I ever feel as though my education was interfering with my professional career. And working in a career with a very unpredictable schedule, I was initially nervous that I may not be able to accommodate full-time coursework on top of that. But it was surprisingly manageable in my time at Brown, and I found that I felt not only welcome, but I felt fully capable to complete the mission of both my job and my educational mission at the same time. And that was truly the combination of two dreams combining into one, so to speak.
That's awesome. Sean, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sean sort of typifies so many of the things that we aspire for, right? We talk about the idea of learning public health by doing public health. Here was a guy who was doing public health on a day-to-day basis, learning, and I do have to give a shout out to our education office and our online MPH leadership, because it is remarkable how quickly they have built a program that has grown, but the metric is not how big are we, it's how good are we, how well are we able to meet the needs and requirements of our students, how well can we offer a distinctive Brown education? And I think our online MPH program has really done an extraordinary job of that. So thank you very much. All right, we'll give them a round of applause, the online MPH folks, okay. So when I think about what it is that we try to teach students like Sean, it all sort of begins with the foundations of public health knowledge. We are a school that is focused on knowledge. In that case, imparting knowledge to students. We heard it from Brandon about kind of innovative ways of doing that, making it relevant, making it useful. But obviously, a big part of the mission of the school is generating knowledge, research. And what we know is that knowledge drives action, that knowledge is the force that has led to massive gains in human longevity and human well-being. We also know that knowledge without action is not particularly useful. I think one of the things we're learning these days is that action without knowledge can be pretty dangerous. And so we are a school pretty committed to generating the highest quality of knowledge and evidence that we can. And the truth is that high-quality research, high-quality knowledge generation is hard. It takes data, it takes high-quality analysis, rigorously done. And when you think about the metrics, here's one piece of data. Last year, our faculty published over 1,000 papers. It's a lot, about 3 per day. But it's not about the volume. Right? I think we'd all agree the goal is not how can we publish more papers than anybody else. It's about the quality of that work. And when I think about high-quality science at the school, there are a lot of great scientists. But one of the first people that comes to my mind is a professor of biostatistics named Rebecca Hubbard. So I'd love to have Rebecca come up to the stage. Thank you for coming up, Rebecca. All right, so many of you know Rebecca. She is a professor of biostatistics. We stole her a little over a year ago from the University of Pennsylvania. She needed to upgrade the institution, and so we were happy to have her. No, I'm kidding. Rebecca works on a range of issues. But when I think about her work, so much of it is about how to do science better. And so Rebecca, have a seat, and I want to talk a little bit about that with you. So over the last many years, but certainly even in the last 6 months or a year, we've had a lot of conversations about the importance of randomized trials and how randomized controlled trials represent gold standard science. But I think one of the things that people have recognized for a long time is that there are a lot of questions that cannot be answered by randomized trials. It's impractical, it's undoable, and so we often end up relying on real-world evidence. And you heard from Brandon, and actually a great example, I thought that was actually a fantastic example, of if you don't think about the implications of real-world evidence and real-world data, and I'm talking about data that's generated in the context of, let's say, clinical care, you can get a lot of questions wrong, or the answers wrong. This is an area you've spent a lot of time thinking about. And so I would love it if you would talk to us about how you think about the importance of looking at real-world evidence, and how you think about analyzing questions, answering questions in a way that don't fall into some of the traps that Brandon mentioned.
So when I think about generating evidence and really providing the highest quality evidence that we can, I think you have to do it in a way that integrates multiple different sources. So RCTs are and will continue to be the gold standard for evidence generation for answering medical questions. However, there's a lot of frustration with RCTs. They're slow, they're expensive. They exclude populations who have limited access to participation in RCTs. There's selection bias, lack of generalizability. Real-world data is so enticing because it's everywhere. Everything that we do now is mediated by electronic devices and leaves behind a digital trace. So there's a lot of opportunities to not replace RCT evidence, but supplement, augment RCT evidence with what we can learn from real-world data. When I think about real-world data and the challenges, but also the opportunities are more timely evidence, greater generalizability, and really understanding what health interventions look like in the community. So when healthcare is actually delivered to real people as they receive it out there in the real world, what does that look like? Enormous opportunities. Also, enormous opportunities for pitfalls. And I think part of the excitement and the enthusiasm to fill these evidentiary gaps with real-world data leads people to kind of rush into the breach and say, we've got these data, they came from medical claims or from EHR, and there's so many of them, there are millions of people, what can possibly go wrong? I remember during the pandemic seeing a person saying on Twitter, like, the data, there's so much data, the data are so enormous, we can't possibly get the wrong answer. And that is just completely false. So when I think about real-world data and the opportunities, but also the challenges, it's all really rooted in thinking about the data generating mechanism, which is kind of the fancy biostatistics way of saying, where did the data come from? What was the process by which they arose? And when we start to use real-world data for evidence generation for answering biomedical questions, we have to go back to those sources and think about the fact that EHR data exists because someone chose to go to the healthcare system and they had access to the healthcare system. So the information that we see, the people that we see, the data elements that are collected are all going to be filtered through that lens. Who was able to access care? Once they did, what sort of tests were recommended for them? What were they able to receive? And that's going to critically affect things that we've thought about in statistics for a long time, like missing data, misclassification, measurement error, informative observation processes. So we can answer really interesting, timely questions using real-world data, but we can't get a good, reliable answer, a truly high-quality real-world evidence until we've grappled with those issues.
And can you give an example of your work where you have done exactly that and what you've learned?
Sure. So let me give an example that arises in the context of a methodological problem that we sort of stumbled into in the context of answering a real medical question. I was working with a biostatistics PhD student, and we had access to oncology EHR data, which can be very valuable for understanding what do cancer treatments look like in the real world? What treatments do people actually receive? What do their outcomes look like when you're outside of the very rarefied setting of an RCT? So we wanted to answer a question about 2 chemotherapy agents that were being compared head-to-head in treatment for advanced breast cancer. These 2 treatments had been compared previously in an RCT, and they'd been found to be equally effective. But we wanted to know if we translate this into the real world, into the care that people are actually receiving in the community, is that still the case? We did this using an approach that's very popular right now called target trial emulation. So in target trial emulation, the objective is, let's try to avoid some of the traditional pitfalls of observational data analysis by structuring our observational analysis as closely as possible to resemble the way we would analyze an RCT. And so we can do this, we can set up our data to be very similar, and one obvious difference is lack of randomization. So right away we have to grapple with the fact that patients receiving treatment A are not necessarily like patients receiving treatment B. But setting that aside, a lot of people have dealt with those causal inference questions, and what people had ignored were the more fundamental questions of how do you even describe your patient population in the same way that was done in an RCT using EHR data. We don't have the same depth of information available. We don't have the same measures recorded on every patient at the same time. So a really fundamental question is, when we want to just create our study cohort using EHR data and have it resemble the RCT cohort, what if we do if the inclusion-exclusion criteria, the eligibility criteria, are missing? So we're not even sure who should be in our cohort. So together with the student, this is the question that we set out to answer. The previous work in the target trial emulation literature had been very ad hoc. It was just sort of like, if you don't know about their eligibility criteria, just exclude them, or just assume that they probably would have been included. So we conducted a rigorous methodological investigation, found, not surprisingly, that was not a good strategy. But you can use some fairly straightforward machine learning-based imputation approaches to avoid that pitfall. Then we applied this in the real context of the oncology EHR data that we were seeking to answer the question in, and found, indeed, we were able to replicate the RCT results, found that even out in the community, in the real world, both of these chemotherapeutic agents were equally effective. But importantly, in a real-world population, overall survival was about 10% lower at 3 years than what had been observed in the RCT. So this is something we've seen again and again. Real-world populations tend to have poorer prognosis than the very carefully collected RCT populations. And so it was reassuring to know patients could still derive benefit from these treatments, even in the real world. But we have to understand the context in which they're being treated, the supportive care that they receive, and the differences that they experience.
Awesome. Rebecca, thank you so much for coming up and chatting with us.
Thank you.
So, as you listen to Rebecca, first of all, you get a sense of how complicated this stuff is and how tempting it is to just bypass all of this and say, well, we have a large data set, and it's really, really large, and big has got to be good. And the only problem with that is you often get wrong answers, as Brandon pointed out with the selection bias issue with OxyContin. And so one of the things I love about our school is we have people who are willing to grapple with the methodologic complexities, not because they're nerds, so they're also nerds, let's be honest, but because they know that grappling with the methodologic complexities is how you overcome the risk of getting things wrong. Because if you get things wrong, it has real-world implications for patients out in the community who are going to get the wrong treatment, or who might end up getting OxyContin that's thought to be safer but is not any safer. So Rebecca's work is a great example of the importance of doing the hard work, of doing the deep dive that actually ends up making a difference. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about, we've talked about the importance of doing research, 1,000 research papers published at the school last year, which is extraordinary, and the importance of doing research well. But we all know that if the metric that I started off with, which is the state of the school is strong because we are having more impact than ever, great research unto itself doesn't have the impact that it needs to. That research needs to be translated. It needs to be communicated. So I want to talk a little bit about how we do that at the School of Public Health. There are lots of metrics, but I want to start off with a few. Now, translation comes in lots of different forms. One of them is in the media, just getting the information out to the public. Used to be that often people thought, well, that's not really important stuff. Turns out public health begins with the public, and engaging the public is enormously important. And last year, our school was mentioned 5,000 times in news clips across the country. That comes out, if you think about it, It's about 12 a day. About 12 times a day, the Brown School of Public Health, one of our faculty, was mentioned in the news. That is an enormous amount of exposure. It's an enormous amount of engagement with the public. And that showed up in everywhere from local WPRI to the New York Times, NPR, Food and Wine magazine. That's when you know you've made it. That's the great paper on looking at white wine versus red wine and cancer risk, suggesting that there is no benefit of red wine over white wine. So all of you Sauvignon Blanc lovers, you are in good shape. But the point here is that we have been very, very engaged in communicating with the public, not because we want our name out there, but because you're not going to shape public health unless you're willing to engage the public. And we have a school that is deeply interested and deeply ready to engage the American public, the global public. Now that's really important. But a lot of translation happens much more up close and personal. And here I want to talk about a few metrics, and then I want to bring up another colleague up to the stage. Over the last year, we've had more than 100 meetings with congressional staff, about one every 2 weekdays. You don't generally meet with them on weekends and holidays, but almost every other day, somebody on our faculty, somebody on our staff is meeting with congressional staff. About 45 meetings with state staff, that's about one a week. We've had lots and lots of testimonies in front of Congress, in front of federal commissions, in front of state houses. Today, Chris Whaley, professor in HSPP, is testifying in front of the House Ways and Means Committee about nonprofit hospitals and whether nonprofit hospitals deserve their nonprofit status and what the trade-offs are. This is something that we are doing in a very substantial way. About a year and a half ago, we opened a DC office for the School of Public Health. When we first proposed the idea of having a DC office, I think there was a lot of questions and pushback, and why do we need to be in DC, and how does DC affect our lives? I think we've answered the question in the last 6 months of whether engagement in Washington affects our lives or not. And I want to bring up to stage Jared Perkins, who is the Director of Health Policy Strategy for the school. Jared, thanks for being here and thanks for coming up. Thank you. Please grab a seat. So we stole Jared from the RAND Corporation, where you were doing similar but not as important work, of course, as doing. Oh, RAND's okay. RAND's all right. So Jared, I'm going to start. I gave a bunch of numbers, congressional staff, meeting with congressional members. There is a bit of a view inside the academy that policymakers are not always interested in evidence and data. And I'd love it if you could just address that head on. What has your experience been on the question of are policymakers interested in evidence and data?
Yeah, I think for me personally, I do think that policymakers are very interested in evidence and data. There was a Congressional Management Foundation survey, and so this is a survey that's done of all congressional staff on Capitol Hill, both Democrats and Republicans, that found that 99% of Hill staff want access to high-quality, evidence-based research.
99%.
99%.
I'd love to know who the 1% is. We're like, no, we're good.
And then only 32% of them felt like they had that access to that high-quality data. So that's about 78% of the staff who feel like that themselves and their members don't have access to that data. And so I don't think it's necessarily that they don't want that access. It's more of a barrier of a lot of the data siloed. Like you mentioned, there's 1,000 papers coming out of the Brown School of Public Health. Like, how do they decipher all of that data and research that's coming out, and how do they find ways to utilize it? And so that's one of our main goals in the Center for Advancing Health Policy through Research, is to bridge that gap between the researchers and the policymaking community to make sure that they have the best quality data in their hands so they can make the most informed policy decisions.
Awesome. So you started off doing this for CAPER. Mm-hmm. I feel like over time you have expanded your focus to many more faculty across the school, which is awesome. Tell me a little bit about how it works. How do you engage with congressional staff? How do you meet that gap between people who are like, I want more data, but I don't know, like 1,000 papers out of the Brown School of Public Health, and then there are like 200 schools of public health. That is just a voluminous amount of information. How do you engage them? How do you help them navigate it? How do you become a trusted source of information?
Yeah, I think the first thing is building relationships. I think that is the key to really engaging policymakers. It's kind of monitoring what Congress is doing, finding out the issues that are most important to them, and looking for opportunities that you can connect with them on the topics that are of interest to them. And so really building those trusted relationships, showing ways that you can be a resource to them all, I think is hugely important. I think the second is kind of external communications and figuring out your message, right? Oftentimes, people think that maybe they can't communicate with one side of the aisle versus the other based on their research, but a lot of times it's just tailoring your research and messaging it in a way that will resonate with them. Oftentimes, when you think of members of Congress, what they're interested in is what's impacting their constituents. So ways that you can kind of showcase your data and how it's impacting their specific state or their specific constituency, I think is always huge.
You sort of answered this, but one of the kind of elephants in the room on this issue is I think there is a sense that there is a partisan divide in the interest in evidence. But I have never heard you say, and I've talked a lot over the time you've been here, I've never heard you say that you feel like this is a deeply partisan issue. Is that fair? And then how do you engage with people across the political spectrum to make sure that you are seen as nonpartisan and that you are seen as an honest broker?
Yeah, I think the one thing that we always kind of revert back to is that a lot of what we're finding is based in grounded research and evidence, and the way that we kind of push potential policy options is we showcase them as options, right? We're not recommending that staff move forward unless we're pushing them towards one direction or the other. We're like, hey, you want to address something in the Medicare Advantage program, here's a list of policy options that you can do so. And I know Aaron will touch on how they kind of develop some of those policy options, but it can be anything from small tweaks to the MA program, completely revamping the MA program. So it's more of laying out and putting the power into the policymaking staff to make those decisions based on the information they're getting from us.
Awesome. Jared, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
One of the other things that I've often found really impressive about Jared and his team in Washington doing this stuff is while ostensibly they're there to promote the research coming out of the Brown School of Public Health, they really do work on being honest brokers. And one of the things I've heard him talk about is there is a question that somebody might have where we don't have a faculty member working on that topic. That's fine. He will point to, and his team will point to, great work coming out of other universities and other researchers. Because at the end of the day, the goal is to be helpful, to be reliable, to be an honest source of information, more than to be a promoter of the School of Public Health. And if you do the former, you end up doing the latter really, really well. So the kind of translation Jared does, and his, in Washington is really important. There's another kind of translation that we have been very focused on at the school. And for this, as I talk about it, I want to bring up Professor Aaron Fuse-Brown, who came to the school also about a year ago. I feel like it was a bumper crop year a year ago. Aaron, come on up. So Aaron is a professor of health services policy and practice, is a legal scholar, a lawyer. And so I'm going to ask, when we sit down, I'm going to begin the question by asking, what is a lawyer doing in a school of public health? Why are you here?
I ask myself that all the time too. No. So the reason I'm here is, I think common throughout this whole evening's discussion is my goal as a scholar is to do high impact health policy research. So if I want to have the maximum impact on the policymaking process, to me it was a no-brainer to come to Brown because this combination of the evidence base and the rigor for developing the empirical evidence that drives what I do, which is identify legal and policy levers to address those issues that we've characterized very rigorously, and then to work with Jared and others in that space to be able to put it in the hands of the policymakers who can actually do something about it. Like that combination has been, that exists nowhere else. And I was really excited to be a part of that process. And I think that the legal aspect of it is the sort of that bridge between characterizing a policy issue and then being able to come up with those policy options. A lot of those policy options are law. There are changes to the statute. They might be, your agency, CMS already has the regulatory authority to do X, Y, or Z. So, or to point out where law might be a barrier, to say, this payment policy is creating these incentives that are being gamed in this way. So to be able to point out those possibilities, or to say, hey, maybe it's the state government, or maybe it's private enforcement. Someone can enforce the laws that are already on the books to try to get a better outcome. So being able to point those out, a lot of that is legal analysis.
One of the things I think about, and that I feel like I've learned so much from you, is I've written a lot of papers in my life about CMS policy, and the conclusions are always, policymakers should do this. People are like, which policymakers and how? And I'm like, I don't know, policymakers. Those guys in Washington, they should do this. And I think one of that's been really exciting about your work is taking that kind of bucket of policymakers should do this, and actually figuring out who, how. How do we expand that set of efforts? Because it does feel like so much of impact is about specificity. And yet, in general, in schools of public health, we don't have people like you. And so, kind of how do you feel like schools of public health, but really researchers in this field, can do a better job of engaging on that specificity?
So I think this interdisciplinary collaboration between health services researchers and health law scholars and health policy folks is just this incredible opportunity. Often they act in silos. I spent most of my career up until now in the legal academy, and and I regularly cite the literature, the empirical literature, but that's not necessarily like a necessary part of legal scholarship. And to me, it's like, why am I going to spend all this time solving a problem that I don't even know if exists or if I haven't characterized it correctly? But I think encouraging that collaboration, whether it is literally bringing together lawyers into the School of Public Health, bringing up future scholars like students that I teach in my undergraduate health law and policy class, many of whom want to do this work at this intersection. I think that creating the space for that, and we're adding JDs to our ranks all the time, I think that's fantastic, because really it's that secret sauce of putting the two together, having someone who can both understand the evidence and understand the law, and then work together with the folks who can actually, again, put it in the hands of the policymaker, and with the specificity to say, okay, you're drafting a bill. I'll take a look at that language and make sure it actually does what you hope it will do.
That's awesome. Erin, thanks so much for coming
Thanks.
up. Thank you. All right, and Erin is a great example of one of the things that we've thought a lot about at the school, which is that so much of public health is driven not just by traditional public health scholars, most of us in the room, but by bringing in people from the outside who have a lens into public health that's incredibly important and often missing at schools of public health. And there are challenges with that. When we were trying to recruit Erin, there was a question, like, how do you evaluate a legal scholar at a university that doesn't have a law school? But those are barriers that we have to be willing to take on and overcome, because if we get stuck in our professional silos, it's really clear we're not going to have the kind of impact that we are having. All right, so we're getting close to time here. I can see the food getting set up, so let me just wrap up by saying a few things as kind of closing remarks. I want to go back to where we were 45 minutes ago, which is to acknowledge that we truly are in unprecedented times, certainly unprecedented in our lifetimes. I mean, maybe 100 years ago or 150 years ago, we were living through a similar period. But in my lifetime, I can't think of another time where questions like, what is the basic truth, what are facts, is being questioned. That expertise is being undermined and doubted. That we are being asked to make the false choice between systemic changes to improve health and individual liberty. It's a false choice. You can't pursue liberty if you are not healthy, and yet that is a choice that is often falsely brought up in front of us. I really do think that is an extraordinary set of challenges. In that context, what have we done as a school? over the last year. We have doubled down on education, innovative education. We are training more students than we've ever trained, and I think we're training them better than we have ever trained them. We have doubled down on our research mission, writing more papers, writing more high-quality papers, writing papers doing scholarship on more and more important questions that make a difference in people's lives. You got a sense of that. And we are focused on translating all of that through the media, so we're engaged with the public, to Congress, through conversations with staff, through legal scholarship, by taking ideas and figuring out how are we going to actually get this implemented. You heard a version of this from Brandon, who talked about what the innovative stuff he's doing in the classroom and the real-life examples of how it matters. You heard from Sean, who talked about this not as a theoretical, but how the Brown education has impacted his day-to-day life. He's out there in Maui and in Nashville, and what he's learning in the classroom, in the virtual classroom, is shaping how he actually practices public health. You heard from Rebecca about the complexity of using real-world data and how if you don't get it right, you can get the answers wrong and actually cause more harm. But there are scholars willing to dig in. And then you heard from Jared and Aaron about the process that's so important, engaging on this. I'll finish up by a couple of more points. I spent a lot of time talking to public health leaders and deans of schools of public health, and a lot of them are feeling down. And a lot of them are wondering, why are we even doing what we're doing right now? And it is very tempting to withdraw and to pull back. And my answer to them, to the extent that I have an answer, is I think we're doing what we're doing because it matters, because it's meaningful. And I think we are actually having an impact in the world by educating people, by doing better research, by doing that translation. But also, when I take a step back and think about our school and all of the things that we have been through in the last year, the difficulties, the challenges, what I find when I come in to 121 and take the elevator up, and especially if I come in around 9 and there are like 15 people in the elevator and we stop on every stop and we have conversations, is I find a school that's incredibly vibrant during this very difficult time. I find a school where people deeply care about each other. I find a school that's actually pretty fun. And increasingly, I find a school where there is space for disagreement and discussion and debate, which is essential at this moment. Because one of the things that's very clear is none of us have all the answers for how we navigate this time. And when I look through that lens of impact, of students, of research, of translation, and then the community we have built, and I think about the work, and I think about all of you, and I go back to the question that I began to answer as I sat down to put together my remarks for the state of the school, and the question of what is the state of the school, it is very clear to me that because of the work that all of you are doing, the school has never been stronger. And I think our future, as complicated as it is bright. And if we continue to do the work we are doing, it'll continue to be meaningful, and it'll continue to have impact. Thank you all for being here today, and thanks for listening.